there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's a Saturday morning in Waukesha, Wisconsin in May 2014, and friends Bella, Morgan and Anissa are playing at a local park after spending the night at Morgan's for a birthday sleepover. It was a lovely afternoon. The girls went skating, they played The Sims, giggled endlessly and ate cheese puffs. Just regular 12-year-old girl stuff. But Anissa and Morgan had a secret plan. A plan to kill Bella to appease a fictional character called Slender Man, who they'd read about online and planned to run away with. It was supposed to happen at 2 a.m, then 5:30 a.m, then 9:30 a.m. But the girls keep chickening out. Bella keeps telling them no when they try and get her to lie down or pretend to be asleep or to sit in the corner. It's harder than they anticipated. Finally, during a game of hide and seek at the park, Morgan takes charge. She straddles her best friend in the dirt and tells her, "I'm sorry, I have to do this because it's the only way to save my life. Someone from Creepypasta is stalking me." She stabs Bella 19 times and flees with Anissa by her side. Bleeding, a gravely injured Bella drags herself into a clearing where she's spotted by a passing cyclist.
Came upon a 12-year-old female. She appears to be stabbed.
Stabbed?
Correct.
Are you with this 12-year-old female?
Yeah, she said she's having trouble breathing. She said she was stabbed multiple times.
Stabbed multiple times?
As news of the stabbing lands in the inboxes of newsrooms globally, it becomes clear very quickly. This is a story that the whole world is about to have an opinion on. I'm Gemma Bath, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Slender Man is a creepy, faceless character with long arms and legs and black tentacles that protrude from his back. He wears a black suit and his victims are pulled into a hypnotised state, utterly helpless against him. By 2014, he was viral, gaining notoriety in particular on a site called creepypasta.com, a place for amateur horror stories and young adult content. That's where 12-year-olds Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier found him and became obsessed with him. Morgan had been seeing and hearing things, and they were afraid he had control of her mind and was coming to kill her family. They had to take action. They had to kill someone first. Then they'd run away to Slender Mansion with him and become his proxies. It was the stuff of magic and fantasy for two very young girls, but it was intermixed with severe mental illness on Morgan's part and an undiagnosed disability and mental health condition on Anissa's side. But it's those details, the mental health of these tween girls, that got left behind in 2014 and the years that followed, as the girls were tried as adults and prosecuted with the world's eyes and judgment upon them. When journalist Kathleen Hale decided to write about this case, she wanted to tell the whole story. The story that got lost in the media. The story that not only honoured the victim and shared her terror and recovery, but tried to understand what actually happened, why it happened. The result was her book, Slender Man, a tragic story of online obsession and mental illness. And Kathleen joins us now. Kathleen, firstly, can you take us inside the obsession that was Slender Man in 2014-ish? It was pretty huge online, wasn't it?
It had been about 5 years in 2014 since Slender Man first emerged online in 2009 as part of like a Photoshop contest in the paranormal sort of message boards of a horror forum. And he was born basically in these doctored photos that someone made of children playing and having a good time, but they didn't notice that from afar was a very tall, sort of thin, spectral figure watching them, stalking them. And it sort of just captured the attention of horror fans online who were beginning to congregate in different forums. And by the time this case rolled around in 2014, he had become a semi-popular character on creepypasta.com, which was a fan fiction horror site where people could read each other's amateur horror stories and sort of borrow characters from each other and write original horror fiction. And he was one of many characters featured on the site. And actually, ironically, he wasn't super, super popular in 2014, not as we know him to be now. It wasn't until a heinous, globally infamous crime was committed in his name that he really became the popular sort of horror icon that people know him as today.
And the idea of him as this kind of horror character, did he stalk people, manipulate people, kill people? What was his deal?
So his sort of powers are more about controlling other people and having them do his bidding. In some stories, he is violent, but for the most part, his narratives really revolve around him using mind control to inspire other people to commit violence in his name. And so there's a lot of scary stories about him, getting in the heads of people and making them kill their whole families. And then when they're all done, he comes and he takes them away. But that's basically his number one power, is mind control and getting other people to kill for him. He doesn't have to do it himself because he can worm his way into the minds of vulnerable people. And that's how he enacts violence.
And creepypasta, it's kind of just like a forum, right? A website.
Yeah, it's a website, and it's in 2014 it was very lo-fi. Like it basically looked like a middle schooler's horror blog, like black background, red words, really sort of simple interface. And in fact, a lot of the stories on it were written by children. You could just tell. So it was popular among a certain age group. It wasn't sophisticated like, Reddit or a place like that. It was a bit dorky, very PG-13. The submission guidelines were pretty strict. Nothing could have any kind of like sexual overtones. Everything had to be sort of accessible for middle schoolers. It really felt like a site that was catered toward children.
Well, I guess that makes sense with a name like creepypasta as well.
Yes.
It's
and
that
creepypasta. Yeah. No, it's a great site name. It's a word play on copy and paste. Creepypasta, copy and paste. So it's evocative of what the site is for, which is to basically copy and paste each other's stories into a new, fresh Word document, take away a lot, add some more of your own, upload it, and, the cycle continues.
Can you tell us about where this crime is set? It was a town or city in Wisconsin that you're actually very familiar with, right?
Yes, I grew up nearby. The crime took place in Waukesha, Wisconsin, which is one of the 3 most conservative counties in all of Wisconsin, which is sort of saying something. People who are not from Wisconsin or not from the United States, to really understand it, I guess it reminds me a lot of the Shirley Jackson story, The Lottery.
Mm-hmm.
People are really, really, really friendly, but there are these very strong Gothic undertones, lots of secrets, lots of vengeful attitudes when lines are crossed. But just in terms of what it looks like so that people can picture it, it's extremely suburban, extremely pristine, clean, white, and the sort of extreme far right political culture of this locale cannot be overstated. There's a lot of Trumpism there. Mm-hmm. And when this case was first unfolding, it was 2 years before he won the 2016 election. And all of the forces that were poised to put him into the White House were very much alive and electric and brewing in the state at that time. It's the sort of place where people are very, very wary of outsiders. There's a lot of sort of quiet racism. And there's a sort of misplaced idea that the reason that Waukesha is so safe is because of these tough on crime laws, as they're called in the United States, which, which is, not true, but it's a sort of self-reinforcing ideology that things are safe because things are the way they are. And so that's sort of what the environment is like. But it's beautiful. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. It's a place where you can have a really good life at little cost to yourself, so long as you fit in to what everyone thinks, you should be.
It sounds like the kind of place where a crime like this would be particularly shocking.
Oh, yeah. I think that prior to this, in all of Waukesha, there's a lot of people there. There had been less than one murder per year. And this was not a murder case. It would be widely mistaken as a murder case. But just to give you an idea of how safe and crime-free the area was, like any suburban place in the US, it had its issues with drugs. There were things like that going on. But in terms of violent crime, no, there was nothing. This was the kind of place where something like this no one would have expected this to happen.
It took you 7 years or so to write your book on this. How did you find writing it, approaching the people in the story, trying to gain their trust? Did it help being a somewhat local?
It helped me having been local once they would speak to me. I mean, I grew up so close to where this took place that the girls involved in the story and we had a lot of the same sort of childhood touchstones, the same place where these three girls spent Morgan and Anissa's last night of freedom. That was it's a roller rink where I first held hands with the crush. Like, we had these sort of common cultural monuments. And so once somebody would speak to me, and once maybe they heard the way I spoke, and they could understand that I understood them on this sort of deeper level, I do think that helped us. I was looking at it from the point of view of not just this was a horrible crime. I was also looking at it from the point of view of this is a horrible crime that we committed on the so-called criminals involved in the case. The judicial process that unfolded was a circus, and the laws that came crashing down on these young girls, they need to be revoked and amended. And I just couldn't believe what was happening. And nobody really wanted to look at it from that point of view. To them, my having any compassion for the other two children who were involved in the crime, the assailants, was the same as saying that the victim's experience didn't matter, which is not how I felt at all. But unfortunately, in the US, we're in this place where the two things cannot be true,
it's
right?
Black or white.
You can't have compassion for a victim and have compassion for her attackers.
Yeah.
Those two ideas seemed mutually exclusive to most of the people that I talked to. So it was very hard getting people to talk to me, but Morgan's family opened up to me, and I got to speak to Morgan. And from there, just because of all of the extensive documentation on the case, thousands and thousands of pages of interviews, et cetera, and all of the previous reporting, I was able to very laboriously and, as you mentioned, slowly build a factual timeline of what had happened, which was shocking because the truth of the story was so at odds with the myth that had grown around it. An urban legend had grown around the case, just as the case had grown around an urban legend. And so the true story was it was so much more shocking than what had been reported in the media prior to that.
Well, you mentioned Morgan, and she's the reason that this case is back in the headlines again. She was released only a few weeks ago. The judge made the decision. So January 2025. How did you first come to talk to her, and what was she like?
I came to talk with her because her mom and I had been talking, and I got permission from her mom to speak to her. And Morgan was curious about talking to me because she is a writer and an artist. And we talked a lot about her life, but we also talked a lot about her writing. We would have little sort of like creative writing workshops in the hospital cafeteria when I went to go visit her. And she was 15 when I first met her, and she was a child. She was so childlike, so soft-spoken, so self-loathing, so sweet, and so vulnerable. And at that point, she had been taken away from her family for 3 years and had not hugged her parents outside of a legal or medical setting for that entire time. She'd actually been prohibited. She hadn't been allowed to hug them for 4 months after her arrest. When she was 12 years old. So it was, and they had never seen where she slept. I mean, all these obvious things about being incarcerated, but she was on an adult ward at the age of, she was so young. So I think that was sort of for me the most sort of salient quality that I got from her is just how young she was, and I was shocked by it every time we got together, especially given the context of our meetings. In terms of her personality, she's very smart, can be very funny, very creative, very troubled, and wasn't getting any help at all, despite the environment that she was in. Like, you would think, especially in the US, there's a misconception that these kinds of forensic hospitals, which used to be called hospitals for the criminally insane, are more nurturing environments than prisons. I would say they're definitely less physically dangerous than a prison. Less, but that doesn't mean that they're safe. But they're not nurturing. She was receiving almost no therapy. She was receiving no juvenile resources. When we met, she was not receiving any education. She had not been in any kind of a classroom setting or received any kind of academic support since 6th grade when she was arrested. And the entire ward, because of deinstitutionalization in the US in the 70s and 80s, the entire ward was manned not by doctors or nurses, but by these psychiatric care technicians who are entry level. They have no specialized education. They're paid minimum wage, and they're overworked and burnt out. And some of them have criminal records themselves. And the way that they control people on the ward is by using spit hoods, just like lassoing a patient's head with a hood so that they, and restraint boards. So everything about the situation was so surreal and unfair. Like, I mean, that's not justice. That's revenge. They're supposed to be two separate things. I can understand why the victim's family in this situation would want Morgan to suffer, but I don't know that the entire judicial system should be built around that same impulse.
Well, especially because the idea of sending someone to a hospital rather than a prison, you would think, is to treat them.
Right.
But from what I'm hearing, it sounds very old-fashioned as well, like something out of a horror movie.
It was something out of a horror movie. The campus was completely open, so I was able to walk around it, and it was a very old hospital that was built in the 1890s. When they first started admitting patients, it was all women at the time in the 1890s. They were bringing them in for like anger and promiscuity and all of this stuff. But the treatments at the time when it first started were very quaint and gentle. It was like brandy and dancing and gardening. And then the institution over the years, it was deformed into this awful place. So there's a dire need for psychiatric hospitals in our country, but because there's no funding for them, a place like Winnebago, where Morgan spent so many years of her childhood, is basically being turned into a prison and only taking patients found not guilty by reason of insanity. And there's no room for sort of anything else, and there's no resources to even employ full-time doctors and nurses in the way that they desperately need to.
Was she subjected to the spit hoods and the being strapped to boards and all of those things that you mentioned?
No, she really, I think, learned very quickly how to keep her head down and spent a lot of her time feeling really frightened. And she was quite docile because of the heavy-duty drugs that they had her on. They had her on really heavy-duty antipsychotics for a long time. But she was attacked by another patient at the hospital. Everyone knew what she had done, and so that made her sort of a target. She was not abused by the staff to the extent that some patients at Winnebago have been, but she was not nurtured by them either, not helped in any way.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Bath. I'm speaking with author Kathleen Hale about the Slender Man stabbing case in the US. Up next, Kathleen explains the early signs that Morgan Geyser was mentally ill and what the lack of diagnosis led to. I know you didn't speak to her a lot about the crime itself, but you did really delve into her childhood and how her mental health and illness kind of manifested. And it started really young, kind of when she was a toddler. She has memories. Can you take us inside her brain and the descriptions that she gave you?
Sure, yeah. So Morgan was telling me that some of her first memories are being, bitten by ghosts pulling her hair, ghosts hugging her. She would see colors sort of floating like chalk or dust, rainbow colors floating in front of her face. She would see rainbow colors sort of dripping down the walls of her bedroom like paint. And then very gradually, her world became populated by these imaginary friends. One of them was named Sev. She could see him. He took care of her. He was like a handsome boy in his 20s. Always, he stayed that age for her as she got older. He was the same age. And then there was a voice in her head named Maggie, who sort of kept her company and was kind for a long time until she became quite cruel as she got older and the crime got closer and closer. Her mental unraveling, the way that looked to her was that more and more imaginary friends started to populate her life, and she stopped being able to control them when they talked to her, when they didn't talk to her, and they began to scare her, and that was sort of the shift that occurred prior to the stabbing.
Her father was a diagnosed schizophrenic, but her parents, prior to the crime, they didn't really kind of look into her mental health, did they?
No, they didn't. They had plans to tell her about her father, Matt's struggle with mental illness, but they didn't want to scare her. They thought she was too young to know about it. And they had plans to tell her when she turned 16, sort of like magical age, in the US where you get to drive and you get to go to prom. And I guess that they thought that at that age she would be ready. In reality, Morgan knew that something was wrong with her dad. And she would ask him point blank, what is wrong with you? Because he was unmedicated and he was her full-time caregiver from the time she was a baby until this crime occurred. So she spent a lot of time with him and she saw him behave in really strange ways. And he would say, I'll tell you when you're 16. I'll tell you when you're 16. Morgan's mom, Angie, was very devoted to her family, and she was the primary earner. And her job was really intense. She assisted on brain and spine surgeries, and she was on call and would be driving within 100 miles of her house at a moment's notice. And she sometimes worked 7 days a week just to kind of keep the family afloat on a single salary as a surgery technician. So she was often leaving before dawn, before Morgan woke up in the morning, coming home after bedtime, not always, but a lot. And so she was really relying on Matt to be an accurate reporter of what was happening at home. And unfortunately, that just wasn't happening. I always feel very protective of Angie in this story because I know that it's really common for people to say, like, but where were the parents? Especially where was the mother? And, as like a mom, I feel really protective of her because she was doing everything she could to keep her family safe and secure. And I think like any working mom would have loved to have spent more time with her children. But unfortunately, that just wasn't the situation at the time. And so a lot of warning signs were missed. And a lot of it had to do with the lack of communication that was happening between the adults in Morgan's life, especially her teachers. It was actually at school that you see the most documented evidence that something was going very, very badly for Morgan, that she was really suffering and that she was struggling and that she was confused. But the school didn't, they didn't rope her parents into a conversation about it. They didn't address it. They ignored it. They told police later that they thought that Morgan was just trying to get attention, which culturally in that area is considered a very bad character flaw, right? What could be worse in a Scandinavian culture than wanting to be an individual, not wanting to conform, not wanting to be part of the collective? And so they tried to correct it. And they said this themselves by withholding the attention that they thought that she craved. So they just ignored her. And that to me was much more upsetting than anything, on Angie's part, because Angie wasn't seeing Morgan painting with her own blood, which is what Morgan's math teacher saw her doing, or like barking on the playground, or any of the other things, writing die over and over again in her notebook. And so her mother had a really incomplete picture of what was happening with Morgan. And by the time I met them, Angie felt so bad. I mean, Morgan felt terrible for what she had done. And Angie felt an immense amount of anguish and guilt too. She had missed this. And as a result, she had lost her daughter.
Those kind of antics that you describe Morgan doing, writing in her blood, things like that, she didn't have a lot of friends. She was considered weird by kids at school because of stuff like that. But she did have a really close friendship with a girl called Payton, who you refer to as Bella because that was her nickname at the time. Can you tell us about their friendship? Because they really were, from your descriptions, kind of chalk and cheese. They were completely different.
Yeah, they were very, very different. Morgan was very dark. Bella was very light. Bella was bubbly and sweet and normal and not very imaginative and very literal. And Morgan was extremely imaginative and she wore dark clothes and patterned with like human skulls, and she wore a black heart pendant around her neck, and Bella wore like rainbows and butterfly wings, and it just sort of captures the dynamic of their friendship. And basically the way that they came together was in fourth grade. Bella was, for some reason, even less popular than Morgan was. Who knows? I mean, kids have all sorts of ways of deciding what the social hierarchies are. And no one would sit with her at lunch. And Morgan one day crossed the cafeteria to sit with Bella because she liked the way that Bella drew kitty cats. And that was the thing that sort of brought them together. And they both loved dolls and cats and the color purple. And, Bella, for Morgan's sake, pretended to like Star Trek. She also pretended to see and hear Morgan's imaginary friends. And that sort of binded them together. And, fast forward 2 years to sixth grade, things are really shifting fast. Bella is now becoming more liked by her peers because she's so kind and so sweet, and Morgan is becoming more and more unpopular. People are really bullying her. They'll bump into her on purpose just to pretend to need to wash their hands and scream that they've touched her. And Bella is approached by the popular crowd and they say, you can join us if you stop being friends with Morgan. And Bella refused because Morgan had come to her aid during a time when she had nobody. And that had inspired such a deep loyalty in her that she was willing to stick it out with Morgan. And obviously that's a decision that she really came to regret.
Even Bella's parents were quite wary of Morgan.
Yes. I mean, Morgan set their basement on fire.
That'll do it.
That'll do it. But, they didn't tell her parents. Like, I mean, I can't imagine if somebody set fire to my house. It's reflective of, like I said, a very, very specific Wisconsin, Midwestern Gothic culture where there's a lot of silence around anything that would require a social interaction, a confrontation that might not be just like friendly, talking about the weather, keeping things at the surface. Like, that's a difficult conversation to have. And so she just didn't have it. And so, but they really didn't. Bella's mom, Stacy, really didn't like Morgan. And Morgan later told me that she felt like, and she said this almost in an admiring way, that Stacy was the only person in her life who knew that there was something wrong with her.
She noticed.
Yeah, she noticed. She noticed something that nobody else noticed about Morgan, and she did what she could to try to extricate the two girls, but she did it in sort of a roundabout way where she would try to like encourage Bella to, hang out with more popular kids, or, make up an excuse for why Bella couldn't go to Morgan's, things that were sort of easily ignored or circumvented. I don't think that there was ever a conversation like, this doesn't feel good. And in fact, she and Bella's dad, Joe, were sort of at odds about it. Joe was pretty warm toward Morgan. I saw it in the courtroom too, the way that Bella's parents were divided by their approach to the aftermath of the crime. Bella's mom was at every hearing, really wanted the most extreme punishment for Morgan, which anyone can understand why Bella's mom would want that. And Joe was a bit more expansive. He held the door for Morgan's mom in court, little gestures that I think they frayed the relationship over time, and they ended up divorcing after this crime unfolded. I'm not saying it's just because of that, obviously. It's just that, you could see the differences in their reactions to this tragedy, and that's something that pulls couples apart when they don't react to something like that in lockstep with each other.
When did Anissa come into their lives, and how did she kind of change the dynamic between the girls?
Anissa, she joined Morgan and Bella's middle school at the beginning of 6th grade. Anissa switched school districts, so they were all going to a new middle school. Middle school starts in 6th grade in the US, but Bella and Morgan had gone to elementary school together, and Anissa was the new kid. And Anissa also happened to be Morgan's neighbor in the same apartment complex. And she began as Morgan's bully. She would bully Morgan just like the other kids bullied Morgan. But sort of gradually she realized that Morgan was interested in the same things that she was interested in, which made them both very different. I mean, they both liked horror stories. They liked dark things. It's not something that girls in Waukesha, Wisconsin are really like celebrated for being into. I mean, this was when people were doing like the ice bucket challenge, like
I remember.
that's what Bella wanted to do, the ice bucket challenge. She wanted to do like social media pranks to like raise awareness for like causes, and Morgan wanted to like read conspiracy theories online. It was a very different thing. And so Anissa noticed that about her, and something kind of clicked between them. At the time, Anissa's parents were getting divorced. Stuff at home was really bad. She had a lot of reasons to want to leave home. And she was lonely. She was super lonely. She was a bully, which meant that in some ways she had power over other children, but she didn't have any friends. She operated kind of as a rule enforcer, which is where her bullying came from. Like she would, when kids didn't follow the rules in class, she would punch them or call them names while the teacher wasn't looking. She was very good at executing that kind of like justice in her mind when adults weren't looking. Later, all of her teachers would be like, she was amazing. And all of the kids would be like, she was a nightmare. And she had this fantasy of wanting to save the world, but basically she just wanted friends. And she was obsessed with Morgan, but Bella stood between them. Morgan already had a best friend, and that was always sort of a thorn in Anissa's side.
Slender Man kind of became this common ground between Anissa and Morgan, like an obsession. They started to read about Slender Man and obsess about him and his character. But how did an obsession with this creepy fictional character kind of morph into, there's no other way to describe it, but a murder plot, and a murder plot to kill Bella?
Yeah, it was gradual, and it would also never have happened if Morgan and Anissa had not found each other. None of this would have happened. Basically, Morgan had no one to talk to about the things that she was seeing and hearing, the hallucinations that she was having. She tried to talk to Bella about it. Bella was like, I lied about seeing and hearing your imaginary friends. I don't want to play this game anymore. I'm scared. You're scaring me. It's not nice. It's mean. And so Morgan felt like if she were to confide in Bella, that she was going to lose Bella, and she didn't want to lose Bella. And eventually it came up with Anissa that Morgan saw and heard these things. And Anissa was intrigued because she believed in magic and dark forces. And, she had this creeping sense of dread. And that's why she loved horror stories, because they validated this feeling that she had all the time. And so Morgan at that point was really afraid that she might be going crazy. You can see it in her Google searches. She was searching for like, what kind of insane am I? If Anissa had said like, I think maybe you are like, crazy, things might have gone differently. But instead she goes, no, I think you're a medium. I think that you straddle two worlds and you're in touch with this side of life that like no one else understands. So she made Morgan feel, special in this way that was really reassuring to Morgan, but also scary, right? Because then it means that all of these things that she's seeing and hearing are real. And so she keeps opening up to Anissa, and she shares that at one point in her childhood, the scariest thing she ever saw was she was looking in the mirror and she saw this shadowy figure standing behind her, really tall and thin. And Anissa's like, I've seen him too. His name is Slender Man. And that's when she introduced Morgan to creepypasta.com. And basically between all of these different variables, what they came up with was that Slender Man had appeared to Morgan when she was a young child as a warning. And now he was sending like demons at her to sort of like to warn her that he would come back and kill her and her family and Anissa's family and maybe the whole human race, like in the creepypasta stories that they read, if they didn't sacrifice another human being in his name, like in the scary stories that they read. So they just put all these pieces together. And it was basically, when you sort of zoom out, it was two 12-year-old girls, one of whom, Anissa, had a very severe learning disability that was undiagnosed at the time, where she could not tell the difference between reality and fantasy. And then you have another girl who's severely mentally ill. And together, at the age of 12, they're trying to diagnose her. They're trying to figure out, without any help, what is wrong. And so this is what they came up with. Now, in terms of choosing Bella as the victim, that is the one piece of this puzzle that will probably always be a mystery. It's the only place where Morgan and Anissa's testimonies diverge. Each one blamed the other for picking Bella. So like what Morgan said to me is that Anissa said that it had to be someone that Morgan loved. And isn't that convenient also that Anissa happens to hate Bella, and Morgan really only loved one person other than her family, and that's Bella. So it was pretty obvious who Anissa was talking about. And Anissa would tell police that it was Morgan's idea, that Morgan was like, we have to kill Bella for Slender Man. And so it's unclear whose idea it was exactly, but I think the one thing that is consistent even in that piece of the story is that Morgan and Anissa chose Bella because Morgan loved Bella. So it wasn't because Morgan hated Bella. It was because it was the opposite. It was that Bella was the most important person in the world to her. And that was the only thing she thought that would make the sacrifice count.
After the break, Kathleen tells us what Morgan and Anissa were planning to do to Bella and what exactly went down on the night of the Slender Man's sacrifice. When you read the details of what these two 12-year-olds did to Bella, flat on a news report, it's kind of like they lured her into the forest playing hide and seek, they stabbed her. When you read it in your book, it's so obvious when you break it all down that these are they're 12-year-old girls, and the way they're thinking into how this plot kind of unravels really kind of shows that. And I want to kind of help the audience understand that by kind of explaining that this started with skating at a sleepover, playing Sims, eating cheese puffs, being in a pillow fort, like regular 12-year-old girl stuff. And then this plan that they kind of had in the back of the sleepover, which was like, we've got to kill her, but how do we do it? And they kind of keep chickening out, don't they, over the course of the night?
they chicken out several times, and Morgan comes up with these kind of magical thinking type ways of avoiding the stabbing, like without actually stopping it. Like she thinks she can stop it if she does this, she can stop it if she does that. When you said that the real timeline of events leading up to this stabbing, the most glaring thing about it is that these were 12-year-old girls. Like I laughed a little bit, not because it's funny, but because it's so true. Like it's like when you read the police reports and the interviews and the way that they were thinking, the things that they were doing, they were so unbelievably, shockingly young, and the way that their minds worked were it was their minds worked with the absurdity of a child's mind, like and so there are moments in that narrative leading up to the stabbing where you kind of it's absurd to the point of feeling like it's yes. So anyway, so what happened was it was a Friday, Saturday sleepover. On Friday night, they went to Skateland, which is a roller rink, and they skated. They had they had a fun time. They held hands. They ate creamsicles. They went home. They gave Morgan her birthday presents, which like included a stuffed banana and a Star Trek mug, among other things. They played The Sims. Anissa and Bella shared a bed. They slept head to foot. Bella slept with a dolly. She brought 9 cat magazines with her to the sleepover.
It's so innocent. It sounds also innocent.
Yeah, it sounds so innocent. And the plan kept getting subverted. The plan had been to kill Bella that night right away. The initial plan that they came up with was that after Bella fell asleep, Anissa was going to stab her and then to death, and then they were going to leave her body in a sleeping bag and slip out in the middle of the night so that if anyone came in, it would look like she was sleeping. But by the time Bella fell asleep, Anissa was so tired from roller skating so much that she was too tired to kill anybody. So Morgan said, well, let's just rest. I'll set an alarm on my phone for 2:30 a.m. But she didn't set the alarm because she didn't want the stabbing to happen. But because she was a child, she thought that that was like a way to avoid the tragedy. She didn't want to make Anissa mad, is sort of the thing that was like leading her. So then Anissa woke up in the morning and she was furious at Morgan for not setting the alarm. And then Morgan got permission from her parents to go play outside at the nearby park. They'd only let her do it like once before, but they reasoned that girls are safer in a group usually, so they let them go. And then the plan had become to kill Bella in the playground restroom because Anissa thought it would work because it had a drain for the blood to go down. So they brought her in there, telling her that they wanted to show her some vandalism in the toilets. She quickly realized that this was not true. And then, but she didn't leave because, I mean, who would think that, who would think, she thought that they were being mean, that they were gossiping about her, that they were whispering about her. She wasn't having fun. She wanted to go home. She felt like they were excluding her, but she didn't call her mom because she wanted to be a good friend to Morgan. Anissa tried to knock Bella unconscious in the bathroom, which sounds quite violent. It sounds like anybody would have left that situation if they had been Bella. But Anissa was, by her own admission, she used these words, I'm not very athletic. She's also 12. She also thought that to kill somebody, you just like kind of boop them on the head, like in a video game. And so she just like sort of pushed Bella's head like that. And Bella was like, ow, like but she obviously was not knocked unconscious. And so then Anissa didn't know what to do. So they thought, let's go into the woods. So they asked Bella if she wanted to go bird watching. She said no. She was sulking at this point. So they said hide and seek. She agreed to play hide and seek. They actually played one game the normal way. They, Morgan counted and they hid and she found them, and then they played again. And that time when Morgan found Anissa and Bella in a clearing, she couldn't go through with it at first. And Anissa got into a fight about who was going to do it. They're fighting off at the side of this clearing, passing the knife that they've taken from Morgan's kitchen. They're passing it back and forth. And Morgan's finally, said something that annoyed Anissa so much because she's not sticking to the plan that Anissa turns to leave and just walk away. And if she had, this would not have happened. But instead she turned around and she said, "Kitty now." And Kitty was her like pet name for Morgan. And it sort of ignited something in Morgan. She said to Morgan, "Go berserk, go crazy." Morgan tackled Bella. She said, "Don't worry, I'm just a little kitty cat." And then she stabbed Bella 19 times.
It's a miracle she lived 19 times. How did she live?
Well, there's a few things. One is that it was a medical miracle. One of the stab wounds missed her heart by a millimeter or something crazy like that. So that's part of it. There was one stab wound that should have killed her. She was stabbed in the torso, in the arms. It was awful. The other thing is that Morgan was still in this mindset of, I don't want this to happen. I don't want this to happen. And if you look at the size, at the scope of each individual wound, and by that I mean in the police report they measure it, centimeters, millimeters, the whole. She was using a 6-inch blade and barely breaking the surface in a lot of these strikes. Very, very, very small wounds, and that's not to minimize the violence of this crime. Is awful. And Bella suffered enormously. She had to have multiple life-saving surgeries that left her with so much scarring from her throat to her abdomen. I mean, it's a huge trauma. But what I'm saying is Morgan was not pressing very hard. She was flailing and going through the motions of this stabbing. And of course, when you stab somebody that many times, you're going to create devastating consequences. But if you imagine somebody who doesn't really want to be doing it, who's kind of holding their arm back a bit, who's flailing a bit more than actually striking, those were the kinds of wounds that not all 19 wounds were kill wounds.
A few things happened after the stabbing. One, Morgan at one point tried to administer some first aid with a leaf. And
yes,
but then they kind of said to Bella, "We'll go and get help." But they weren't going to go get help. They were basically going to run away to be with Slender Man because that was the plan. How was Bella found? How was she saved?
It's really miraculous, and it's a testament to her bravery and fortitude and intelligence, because she had believed them all day about everything, and she, in her desperation, might have believed them when they said they were going to get help. I think another person might have, in that sort of vulnerable moment, and she didn't. And so she started to drag herself through the woods. She couldn't see, she couldn't breathe. And she managed to drag herself all the way out of the woods, probably like 100 yards to a trail off the street. And at that very moment, a bicyclist named Greg Steinberg, who had just finished running a 5K in downtown Waukesha, and he was bicycling home, he crossed the path and he saw her and he saved her. He made the 911 call that saved her life.
What about Morgan and Anissa? How were they? Because obviously word of a stabbing got out very quickly. Police are like, we've got to find these other girls that, how were they tracked down and in what state were they in?
So Morgan and Anissa, after stabbing Bella, they took off. Their plan was to go to what they thought was Slender Man's mansion, called Slender Mansion. And they thought that it was in the Nicolet National Forest, which was 300 miles away. And they were going to walk there without a map or a phone or any provisions other than some maxi pads, because Morgan had just gotten her period, and a couple granola bars and some water bottles. And they were 12, and that was their plan. And, because they didn't have a compass or anything, they walked a lot. They spent a lot of time walking in the wrong direction. They followed the Fox River north. They knew that went north. And then after that, did a meandering sort of walk trying to get around the highway, and that slowed them down. They did manage to walk about 10 miles. But then what happened was they decided to cross a busy highway by walking onto the highway rather than under the highway. And they got onto the highway, and a driver, saw these little girls 4 feet tall walking along the side of a busy road and called the police. And the police were looking for two girls matching that description, one blonde, one brunette, just under 4 feet. And they came and got them very quickly. And by that point, Morgan and Anissa were relieved because it had stopped being fun, and they had started to realize that Slender Man wasn't coming for them.
And Bella had been able to give those descriptions through all of her injuries.
So she was able to tell them it was my best friend. Then she was whisked away into surgery. So she gave the police the names of those girls. They were able to then go to Morgan's house where her parents were. And they also went to Anissa's house and got descriptions of them and what they'd been wearing that way from their parents.
I want to skip to those initial conversations that the girls had with police because, one, their parents weren't with them. Was that legal?
It is in Wisconsin. A lot of strange things are legal in Wisconsin. And one is that you can interview a child about a crime without a parent or attorney present unless the child specifically asks for a lawyer, which, as you can imagine,
Right.
Most kids are not thinking that way. They've been taught to trust the police.
No.
Why would a police officer want to trick me? Why would a police officer want to hurt me? Especially in suburban communities and white suburban communities, people feel that way. So the police interviewed them uninterrupted for 8 hours. And they lied to their parents too about what they were talking to them about. And it's all legal.
How would you describe those conversations? The stuff that jumped out to me, particularly from Anissa, was I don't think she really grasped what had happened. She was asking things like, when am I going to get my clothes back? And, I haven't taken my antihistamine today. It was almost like she didn't realise what had happened.
Yeah.
How would you kind of look at those conversations?
I think is wild. But if you watch it, I mean, what I thought was just, in Morgan's case, I thought this cop really has it out for her. He really hates her. And also you can see how mentally ill Morgan is. You can see all of the signs that she's just completely unraveling and that she's sick and that she needs help. And with Anissa, I mean, I think you see a learning disability on full display. Like, that's something that kind of comes out throughout this case, is if you want to see a monster in these girls, you can see a monster. But if you go into it with the context of their situations, of Anissa's incredibly difficult disability in terms of her processing information, and in terms of Morgan being in a state of psychosis, you can see that she's in a state of psychosis. That's the short answer, is that she is in a state of psychosis for the entire interview. And the police officer questioning her is treating her like a serial killer. And that's the dynamic in her interrogation room. And with Anissa, she has no idea how much trouble she is in. She wants to go back to school on Monday. She wants to make sure that she'll be able to do that. And they talk and talk and talk and talk and talk for hours. And by the time they go out of there, the police have secured a lengthy confession with the explicit purpose of trying to put the girls into an adult prison for over 100 years. The police officer's goal that day was to incarcerate the girls for as long as possible in the most extreme environment possible at an adult women's prison. It was not to understand the crime or why it happened, and it was not to have a deeper understanding of the case. It was to punish the case. And so they went about it using the methods that would best serve that goal.
Morgan's mental health kind of was assessed 5 or so days into prison. So all of this had happened. She'd been placed into a prison. How did her mental health kind of continue to unravel once she was incarcerated? Because it was in that first prison visit that her parents finally kind of clicked and were like, oh.
Yeah. People are like, well, how did no one manage to see it? Well, part of it is that she hid it. And, she hid it as well as an extremely intelligent, high IQ 12-year-old girl with emerging psychosis can hide it. And at the end, she was having a lot of trouble hiding it leading up to the crime, but her friends were helping her hide it. Anissa was helping her hide it. Like Bella was helping her hide it. Other kids were like, what's going on? But they were managing to sort of protect her from any sort of adult scrutiny. But after the crime occurred, she could no longer hide it because she had also gone through a traumatic event. When you try to kill somebody, it sticks in your brain in a real way. It causes PTSD the same way that, you know, someone else trying to kill you will stick in your brain. It's extremely violent, and it broke her and it made her snap. And from then on, she could not hide the symptoms that had been plaguing her prior to that. So she was talking to herself in the open in front of everybody. It was as soon as she was checked into the jail, she was flagged for a psych evaluation. And when by the time her parents managed to get in to see her, which didn't happen for many, 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 many days, they weren't allowed in. She had not washed. She was muttering to herself. She didn't even seem to know that they were there. So she had a full psychotic break post-crime.
Was Anissa also assessed for her mental health at that time?
So that's the really messed up part about the post-crime phase of this story, is that because they were charged as adults, because that is the law in Wisconsin, they did not receive any therapeutic services, which is very messed up. We do provide them to children automatically in the United States, but not to adults. And so because they were adults, they were denied, counseling, they were denied, sort of diagnostic services for a very, very long time. And it was only because Morgan's attorney was having doctors assess her for the trial phase that she was able, and it was only because her attorney petitioned really, really, really hard to get her assessed that she was taken care of. Anissa was never really taken care of therapeutically, at least not during the pre-incarceration phase, which is just so sad. She really could have used some help during that time.
Because it's not too, and this is what a lot of people think, that talking about mental health is excusing the crime, which it's not, but it's hard to separate the two when it comes to this particular story, particularly when we kind of skip forward a bit and we do talk about the assessments that these two girls end up getting. Morgan is eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia, and you've used a sentence in your book that stick to me: sickness cooked her brain like a fever, to the point where she didn't even really remember the crime.
Right.
Can you talk to that?
Yeah, she was really insulated from the event itself. She seemed to the people around her to be remorseless because she was just lost in a world of her own making. From her perspective, Slender Man is coming for her. She is right now in a jail, but there's unicorns in the jail. And there's like Barack Obama is riding through naked on a purple dinosaur. Like that's what she was seeing during that time. So it wasn't until they put her on medication. She told me once that it took 4 years for her to accept that Slender Man wasn't coming and to realize what she had done.
Right. Which people would see as her not showing remorse.
Right. I'll tell you that she feels an extreme amount of remorse. She hates herself to this day on such a deep level. This is something that she lives with and relives every day, and she misses Bella. That's why she chose her when they were children, or that's why this was the crime, is because Morgan loved Bella, not because she hated her. She misses her so much. From one person's point of view, it might look like evil, and then if you look at it a different way, it's like this person is extremely sick and a danger to themselves and others. But it was definitely mistaken as remorselessness, and it wasn't that. It was just that her reality contact was so limited that she wasn't even really grounded in the realization that she had stabbed her best friend.
And then with Anissa, you've talked about the kind of learning disability, but she is also eventually diagnosed with, and I might butcher this, but folie à deux, which is kind of like a shared psychotic disorder.
Yeah. Oh, one thing I do want to say about the remorse and the mental illness thing is that something that Morgan's mom said to me that I thought was really profound and simple and true is that when you have psychosis, you don't have emotions. You don't have them at all. So that's another way of looking at it. Yes. So after the crime, Anissa was diagnosed with folie à deux, and she got very, very lucky in this Wisconsin legal system. In the U.S. legal system, it is so hard to get an NGRI verdict, not guilty by reason of insanity. People think it's very widespread and common. It is statistically almost impossible to get that verdict from juries. So she was very lucky to have gotten it at all, but the defense was very creative. They had to get creative because she didn't have a mental illness. She had a learning disability, which I don't know why they didn't lean into that more, honestly, but they might have just, it might have been too precarious an outcome. But the folie à deux thing, where it came from, is that she hadn't been diagnosed with a mental illness, but they were trying to put her into a safer environment than prison, and a hospital would have been a safer environment because she was going to be in an adult setting regardless. And so folie à deux is a 19th century French diagnosis, which means the madness of two. And it basically is when one person's mental illness spreads to the other because of the closeness of their relationship. And it usually only happens in like married couples. And it does happen where two people get wrapped in a delusion, even though only one of them has a mental illness diagnosis. And so they used that argument with Anissa, but I thought the more persuasive thing, honestly, was that she was so severely learning disabled. I mean, that's kind of all you have to know in that situation. But it was a very, very like creative argument to use, and the jury agreed, and they got very lucky with that.
So what was the decision? What did the jury decide?
The jury decided to give her an NGRI verdict, which meant that she would be serving out a sentence yet to be determined by the judge in a hospital instead of a prison. And he gave her 20 years, which was less than she would have been serving in prison. Luckily, she got out sooner than that. She had to spend the rest of her childhood in an adult psychiatric ward, but she got out.
Morgan's proceedings happened after Anissa's. How different were they? Because she didn't end up going to trial. She took a plea agreement.
Right. There were a couple things happening. Bella's family wanted to avoid a trial because if there were a trial, then Bella would have to testify. And they were really concerned about that and what it would do to her psychologically. Morgan's team wanted to avoid it because if she had been found guilty, she's going to go to prison for at least 65 years. And she was sick and she had been denied medication for 19 months. She was still, really, really struggling. And they wanted her to get therapeutic treatment. And they thought that would be more likely to happen in a hospital. There was also a concern that Anissa's verdict, which had shocked the local community, people were very at odds about it. I mean, on its face, it doesn't sound great that a girl who conspired to stab another local girl got out of prison time because of the entire thing was just very controversial locally, especially because so many of the local population did not believe that mental illness was real. And so the fact that she had gotten off and she didn't even have a mental illness diagnosed was really angering to people. And Morgan's team was concerned that if her case went to trial, even though she had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, even though there was all of this documentation around her mental illness, they were concerned that people would be so angry that the jury would issue a reactionary verdict and at least want to send one of them to prison, So they didn't feel like it was a sure bet, even though it probably should have been. So they took a plea agreement and the judge agreed to give her an NGRI, and he sentenced her to the forensic hospital for 40 years.
How did Bella and her parents react to those sentences or verdicts?
I mean, Bella's family, what they said, their sort of press quotes about it and things basically conveyed that it was unfair that she didn't have to meet the harshest consequences for her behavior. So I don't think that they were were thrilled about it at the time. I think that they wanted the harshest punishment for her. I think that Bella probably is, just from what I know of her, would have been the kind of person who actually would have been happy that Morgan was going to be at a hospital getting sort of the help that she needed, but that her representatives and her spokespeople said that it wasn't fair.
Well, these girls didn't end up serving 20 and 40 years. Anissa got out in 2021. And as we've mentioned, Morgan was released this year, January 2025. So 3 years and, a few more than that respectively. Do we know how they're doing? Have you spoken to Morgan?
I've heard from her family very, I think that it's surreal, the idea that she might be able to, that she will be able to hug her mother outside of a legal medical setting for the first time since she was 12 years old. And I think is struggling to wrap her mind around, in a good way, around the idea that she might be able to go do normal things like go to a library, be allowed in and out of the building where she lives, I think it's surreal, and I think her family is completely overjoyed to have her back. They really didn't think that they were gonna have this moment. They weren't sure about that. So
when the media started reporting on Morgan's release in January 2025, so many years after those initial headlines, do you think that the media has learned anything? Do you think society has learned anything? Are we treating this case differently now?
I think we are. I think it makes me feel really proud, again, to be from Wisconsin, a place that has such a progressive history, such a community-oriented history. And I also think that it signals a few changes in the culture at large. I think that there is much more awareness about mental illness and mental health in general and neurological diversity. There's a real understanding now of neurodiversity, and so we can talk about the case, unlike we did back then. We can talk about the case taking for granted that these things are true, that different human brains are different depending on the circumstances of our upbringings and also our biology. So the same sort of reviled girl who was really burned by society in 2014, she can, exit. She can be released, and the same people who are so angry about her don't even know that she's out there. They don't even know she's out there anymore. So I don't know that the way the internet was in 2014, if it were still that way, I don't know if we'd be getting that same decision, because the judge on the case would still feel very scrutinized.
Lastly, what do you want people to take away from hearing kind of this version of events, your version of events from the book, of kind of delving into more than just the headline?
I would invite people to be interested in the gray areas of good and evil. And, we can be very black and white as human beings in terms of understanding the world. And if you put it into these two categories, you feel a bit safer, because of course, none of us would ever be exposed to evil because we're good, But, I would just invite people into the gray area of this story, because I think once you understand more about it, you realize that something like this could happen to anybody. When a lot of people hear about this story, they think, what if my child was stabbed? And now, having looked at it a bit more closely, I am more haunted by the question of what if my child stabbed somebody? What if I missed something? And something like this happened. I think anybody under the wrong set of circumstances can become an attempted killer. And I think understanding that part of human reality and the human psyche, I don't know, to me it feels important.
Thanks to Kathleen for helping us to tell this story. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast, hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, and Tali Blackman, with audio design by Jacob Round. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.